The rope that held 46 souls. The hemp rope coiled at Desmond Doss's feet like a sleeping serpent, its frayed ends testament to 6 days of impossible use. From his position on the eastern ledge of Hacksaw Ridge, he could hear the distant calls echoing across the plateau above, voices that had haunted his dreams since the 77th Infantry Division's assault had stalled 3 days ago. Each cry of "medic" cut through the morning air like a blade, reminding him that wounded men still lay scattered across that blood-soaked coral limestone, pinned down by Japanese machine gun nests that seemed carved into the very bones of Okinawa itself. Below him, the makeshift aid station buzzed with quiet efficiency. Medics moved between stretchers with the practiced economy of men who had learned to function within the machinery of death. Dr. Patterson, his sleeves rolled up and uniform stained with the evidence of sleepless nights, glanced up at the cliff face with the expression of a man counting souls in increments. Every body that came down that rope represented both a victory and a reminder of how many more remained above. The rope system hadn't been planned. Nothing about this nightmare had been planned. When the division's frontal assault collapsed, leaving dozens of wounded scattered across the plateau like broken dolls, standard evacuation routes had been severed by enemy fire. The 60-foot cliff face had seemed to offer no hope until Doss discovered the narrow ledge system running along the ridge's eastern face. What looked like certain death from above became, through desperate prayer and Tennessee mountain sense, a treacherous lifeline, invisible to Japanese observers. Sergeant Walsh watched from his stretcher as Doss checked the rope's anchor point for the morning's work. The steel rod, bent into a crude pulley, salvaged from a destroyed Japanese artillery piece, groaned under the weight of memory. Walsh remembered hanging suspended halfway down that cliff face on the 4th day, machine gun fire forcing them both to freeze against the rock while hemp fibers snapped one by one above his head. He'd been certain both of them would plummet to their deaths, but something had held. The rope, faith, or simple stubborn physics. "Don't go back up there today, Doss," Walsh murmured, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had stared into the abyss. "Command's talking about pulling the whole line back. This ridge has taken enough good men." Doss's hands trembled as he tested each knot with the methodical precision of ritual. The bowline hitch he'd learned as a boy in the Tennessee hills had never been intended to bear the weight of human souls, yet here it served as the difference between life and death for men whose names he whispered in prayer each night. His fingertips traced the rope's surface, reading the story written in burn marks from friction and cuts from shrapnel. A tactile scripture of 6 days that felt like 6 lifetimes. "Can't leave them up there, Sergeant," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. "Long as there's one more man breathing on that plateau, I got to try." The morning air carried the scent of smoke that had settled into his clothes like a second skin, mixing with the metallic taste of fear that never quite left his mouth. Somewhere above, beyond the lip of the ridge, where nothing but open sky showed, voices continued to call through the maze of shell holes and corpses. Each call represented a decision that no training manual had prepared him for. A choice between the safety of the ledge below and the killing field above, where snipers materialized from hidden caves like deadly phantoms. Private Chen, barely 18 and recovering from his own descent down the rope 2 days earlier, watched Doss prepare for another climb with a mixture of awe and terror. He'd been one of the 46 souls that rope had carried to safety, lowered through darkness while artillery exchanges lit the sky like deadly fireworks. The memory of Doss's steady voice guiding him away from jagged outcroppings still echoed in his dreams, mixed with the sensation of rough hemp burning through his uniform as death waited 60 feet below. As Doss secured his medical bag and prepared to climb back toward the plateau, the weight of 6 days pressed against his chest like a physical burden. Each morning brought the same ritual, the inspection of rope, the whispered prayer, the slow crawl across terrain that shifted constantly, under bombardment. His fellow soldiers had initially scorned his refusal to carry a rifle, but those doubts had evaporated as the casualty count mounted, and that fraying rope became a symbol of hope in a place where hope seemed impossible. The calls from above grew more insistent. As the sun climbed higher, each voice a thread in the tapestry of responsibility that bound him to the plateau. 46 men had already made the journey down that cliff face, carried by hemp and prayer through a space that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of survival. But somewhere in the shell holes above, voices still called his name, and Desmond Doss knew that his morning's work was just beginning. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The climb up the eastern face of Hacksaw Ridge demanded a particular kind of faith, not the comfortable faith of Sunday morning services, but the raw, desperate trust of a man ascending toward certain death on a rope that had already carried 46 souls to safety. Doss's hands moved with practiced economy along the cliff face, each handhold memorized through 6 days of impossible repetition. The coral limestone, sharp as broken glass and slick with morning dew, cut through his gloves like accusations, reminding him that this vertical journey had never been meant for human travel. Below, the 77th Infantry Division's staging area spread out like a miniature city of canvas and desperation. Supply trucks crawled along muddy roads that resembled brown scars across Okinawa's wounded landscape, carrying ammunition and medical supplies that never seemed sufficient for the appetite of the ridge above. Radio chatter drifted up from command posts, fragments of conversation about casualty reports and tactical adjustments that felt abstract when measured against the weight of individual voices calling medic from the plateau's shell holes. As Doss crested the lip of the ridge, the familiar landscape of devastation opened before him like a vision from his darkest prayers. The plateau stretched ahead, cratered and shattered by days of artillery exchange, dotted with the twisted remains of trees that looked like accusing fingers pointed at an empty sky. Somewhere in that maze of destruction, Japanese snipers waited with the patience of ghosts, their positions carved deep into caves that honeycombed the ridge's northern edge like a deadly warren. The first call came from his left, a weak voice barely audible above the wind that swept constantly across the exposed plateau. Doss low-crawled toward the sound, his medical bag dragging behind him like an anchor of hope in a sea of broken coral and shattered equipment. Each movement required calculation. The position of known sniper nests, the rhythm of mortar fire that fell in predictable patterns, the subtle signs that distinguished between the living and the dead in a landscape where both lay scattered like discarded prayers. Lieutenant Morrison, the company commander who had ordered the retreat 2 days earlier, watched from his foxhole near the ridge's southern edge as Doss moved across the killing field with the methodical precision of a man guided by something beyond military training. Morrison's radio crackled with updates from division headquarters, casualty figures, ammunition expenditure reports, requests for tactical assessments that felt meaningless when measured against the sight of one unarmed medic refusing to acknowledge the mathematics of survival. "Doss is back up here," Morrison whispered into his handset, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief that had become familiar over the past week. "Still won't leave the wounded. Command needs to know we've got men refusing direct orders to withdraw." The response from headquarters crackled with static and the distant authority of officers who made decisions from positions measured in miles rather than yards. Orders to document the situation, to maintain operational security, to balance individual heroism against tactical necessity. But Morrison's eyes remained fixed on the figure crawling across the plateau, following calls that led toward positions no sane man would approach. Doss found Private Williams wedged beneath a collapsed section of Japanese fortification, his leg twisted at an angle that spoke of shattered bone and internal bleeding. Williams' face, pale with shock and streaked with the mud that covered everything on the plateau, brightened with desperate relief at the sight of the medic's familiar profile. The evacuation would require careful movement through 50 yards of open ground, timing each advance to the rhythm of sniper fire that swept the area like deadly clockwork. "Thought you forgot about me, Doc," Williams whispered, his voice carrying the particular gratitude of a man who had spent 2 nights listening to bullets crack overhead while wondering if death would come from enemy fire or internal bleeding. "Thought maybe the rope finally broke." Doss's hands worked with automatic precision, applying pressure bandages and checking for signs of spinal injury, while his ears tracked the subtle sounds that indicated enemy movement. The rope waited at the cliff edge, 60 feet of hemp that had become the difference between 46 funerals and 46 reunions with families back home. Each fiber bore the weight of souls carried through darkness, lowered by prayer and stubbornness through a space that existed outside the normal rules of physics and survival. The journey back to the evacuation point required 40 minutes of careful crawling, with Doss dragging Williams on an improvised stretcher made from rifle stocks and shelter halves. Artillery exchanges lit the horizon like deadly fireworks, and mortar rounds fell with the random precision of Russian roulette. But the rope held, as it had held 46 times before, carrying another soul down the cliff face, while enemy fire searched the darkness above for targets that moved like ghosts through a landscape of prayer and desperation. As Williams disappeared over the cliff edge, secured by knots that Doss had learned as a boy but never imagined would serve as the technology of salvation, another call echoed from the plateau's northern edge. The voice carried the particular weakness that indicated serious wounds and time running short. Another decision between the safety of descent and the responsibility that bound him to this killing field like gravity. The shell crater that sheltered Corporal Jenkins had become a small universe of pain and patience, its walls carved by high explosives into a rough sanctuary that offered protection from everything except the slow mathematics of blood loss. Doss slid into the hole with the practiced silence of a man who had learned to move through the landscape of death like a ghost, his medical bag preceding him into the space that smelled of cordite and the metallic sweetness of wounds that had been bleeding for too long. Jenkins lay curled against the crater's eastern wall, his hands pressed against his abdomen in the universal gesture of a man trying to hold his life inside his body. His uniform, once the regulation olive drab of the 77th Infantry Division, had darkened with moisture that could have been rain, sweat, or something more precious. The corporal's face, young beneath the grime and exhaustion that aged every man on Hacksaw Ridge by decades, turned toward Doss with the desperate hope of a drowning man glimpsing a lifeline. "Been hearing you up here for days," Jenkins whispered, his voice carrying the particular breathlessness of internal injuries. "Guys down in the aid station keep talking about the rope. Say you won't quit, no matter what command orders." Doss's hands moved across Jenkins's torso with the gentle precision of assessment, reading the story written in torn fabric and the warmth that spread beneath his fingers. 2 days of exposure on the plateau had taken their toll. Dehydration, shock, and the constant stress of Japanese patrols that moved through the area like deadly currents in an ocean of broken coral. The evacuation would require speed, stealth, and the kind of faith that had carried 46 other souls down a cliff face that seemed designed to prevent human survival. From his position in the aid station below, Dr. Patterson watched the rope grow taut against its anchor point, signaling another descent in progress. The physician had stopped counting the impossible loads that Hempline had carried, stopped trying to calculate the mathematics of survival that defied every principle of military medicine he had learned in medical school and field hospitals from Guadalcanal to Leyte. Each body that arrived at the bottom of the cliff represented both a miracle and a reminder that one man's refusal to carry a weapon had somehow become the most effective rescue operation in the division's history. "How many more up there?" Patterson asked Sergeant Walsh, who lay recovering on a stretcher nearby, his own journey down the rope 3 days earlier still vivid in his memory, like a dream of falling that ended in unexpected safety. "Hard to say, Doc," Walsh replied, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen the plateau's interior geography, mapped in blood and broken equipment. "But Doss won't quit long as he hears voices. That boy's got something driving him that ain't in any field manual." The rope creaked against its improvised pulley as Jenkins began his descent, secured by knots that had been tested 46 times in circumstances that would have challenged the engineering principles of bridges and cranes. Doss controlled the descent from above, his burned palms reading the tension like braille, while his eyes tracked the darkness for muzzle flashes that could transform rescue into tragedy in the space between heartbeats. Japanese voices echoed from positions that seemed to shift like phantoms through the ridge's cave system, calling coordinates and tactical updates in a language that Doss couldn't understand but recognized as the sound of men following orders in circumstances as desperate as his own. The enemy soldiers, entrenched in positions they had carved from living rock over months of preparation, watched the plateau through night vision scopes and periscopes that turned the killing field into a deadly game of hide and seek. As Jenkins reached safety and disappeared into the efficient hands of stretcher-bearers who had learned to work in darkness, Doss felt the familiar weight of decision pressing against his chest. The plateau still held voices, weaker now, scattered across a landscape that shifted constantly under bombardment, but unmistakably human in their desperate calls for help. Each voice represented another choice between the rope that led to safety and the shell holes that led toward positions no military manual recommended approaching. Private Morrison, the young rifleman who had initially mocked Doss's refusal to carry a weapon, watched from his foxhole as the medic prepared for another crawl across the killing field. Morrison's own rifle lay beside him, cleaned and loaded but somehow inadequate, when measured against the sight of one man moving through enemy fire with nothing but medical supplies and a faith that seemed to bend the rules of physics around its quiet determination. "Doss," Morrison called softly, his voice carrying across the crater-pocked ground like a prayer whispered in a cathedral of destruction. "You don't got to prove nothing else. 47 men is enough for any lifetime." The response came as movement rather than words, Doss's figure disappearing into the maze of shell holes that led toward the plateau's northern edge, where voices still called through smoke and darkness. The rope waited at the cliff edge, its fibers bearing the invisible weight of souls carried through impossible circumstances, ready to serve as lifeline for whatever desperate prayer might emerge from the landscape of death that stretched ahead like a test of faith measured in blood and hemp. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The collapsed bunker near Hacksaw Ridge's northern edge had become a tomb of concrete and coral limestone, its interior spaces compressed into geometric impossibilities by the weight of high explosives and time. Doss could hear movement from within the debris, not the random settling of rubble, but the deliberate shifting of something alive, trapped beneath tons of broken fortification. The sound drew him across 50 yards of open ground that Japanese snipers had been watching for 3 days, terrain so exposed that even desperate men had learned to avoid it during daylight hours. Staff Sergeant Torres lay pinned beneath a section of reinforced concrete that had shifted during the morning's artillery exchange, his legs crushed, but his voice still strong enough to call for help through cracks in the rubble that filtered sunlight like broken promises. The extraction would require Doss to partially dismantle the bunker while under sporadic sniper fire, using nothing but his bare hands and a bent bayonet to clear debris that weighed more than the accumulated prayers of his entire lifetime. "Can't feel my legs, Doc," Torres whispered through the gap in the concrete, his voice carrying the particular calmness that came to men who had passed beyond panic into the strange peace of acceptance. "Been watching that rope of yours carry boys down for days. Figured my turn would come eventually." The work demanded a terrible patience, clearing rubble stone by stone, while enemy marksmen searched for movement through scopes that could turn rescue into sudden death. Each piece of debris that Doss lifted and moved represented both progress and exposure, bringing Torres closer to extraction while drawing attention from positions that commanded perfect fields of fire across the plateau's northern approaches. Mortar rounds fell in irregular patterns that suggested Japanese observers were adjusting their aim based on sound and movement, walking death closer to the collapsed bunker with each adjustment. From the aid station below, Dr. Patterson tracked the rope's position against his watch, calculating evacuation times that had become as precise as surgical procedures over 6 days of impossible repetition. 47 souls had made the journey down that cliff face, each descent timed to avoid the enemy patrol patterns that swept the ridge like deadly clockwork. The hemp line had become a calendar of salvation, marking time in lives saved rather than hours passed. Lieutenant Morrison's radio crackled with updates from division headquarters, casualty reports, ammunition expenditure figures, and tactical assessments that felt abstract when measured against the sight of one man dismantling a bunker with his bare hands. The orders remained consistent: withdraw to defensible positions, minimize exposure, conserve resources for the larger offensive that would resume when conditions permitted. But the voices from the plateau continued to call, and Doss continued to answer with the stubborn consistency of a man guided by mathematics that couldn't be calculated in any military manual. The moment of extraction came suddenly, without the dramatic fanfare that later reports would suggest. Torres's legs came free with a grinding sound of concrete against coral limestone, and Doss found himself supporting a man who weighed more than the accumulated exhaustion of 6 days on the ridge. The journey back to the rope anchor point required careful navigation through terrain that seemed designed to prevent human movement. Shell holes deep enough to swallow entire squads, debris fields that shifted underfoot like broken promises, and the constant whisper of bullets that passed close enough to part hair and prayers. Torres's descent proved the most technically challenging yet, requiring Doss to rig an entirely new pulley configuration that would support the staff sergeant's weight while protecting his spinal injuries from further damage. Working by touch in near-total darkness, Doss created a cradle system using rifle slings and shelter halves, testing and retesting each knot while Japanese patrols moved somewhere in the darkness like deadly currents in an ocean of broken coral and scattered equipment. "How you learning this stuff, Doc?" Torres asked as Doss secured the final knots that would carry him to safety. "They teach rope work in medic school?" "Learned it as a boy," Doss replied, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery exchanges that lit the horizon like deadly fireworks. "Never figured it would serve for this kind of work." The actual descent took 40 minutes, with Doss controlling the rope's tension while simultaneously guiding the stretcher away from jagged outcroppings that could prove fatal to a man with spinal injuries. Artillery fire swept the cliff face in irregular patterns, and mortar rounds exploded with the random precision that turned every moment into a gamble with mathematics that couldn't be calculated by any earthly authority. But the rope held as it had held 47 times before, carrying another soul through darkness while enemy fire searched for targets that moved like ghosts through a landscape of prayer and desperation. As Torres disappeared into the efficient care of medics who had learned to function within the machinery of salvation, Doss felt the hemp fibers beginning to separate under his palms. Individual strands popped and frayed under loads that would have challenged the engineering principles of bridges and cranes. But somehow, the line continued to hold, through physics, faith, or the simple, stubborn refusal of inanimate objects to acknowledge the impossibility of their circumstances. The moment that would haunt Desmond Doss for the rest of his life came not during the dramatic rescues that later filled citation reports, but in the quiet darkness between the 48th and 49th evacuations, when the rope finally spoke its truth about the mathematics of miracles. He knelt at the cliff edge with his hands wrapped around hemp fibers that had carried more souls to safety than seemed physically possible, feeling the line separate strand by strand beneath his burning palms like a prayer coming apart under the weight of desperate faith. Private Kim lay secured in the descent cradle 50 feet below, suspended in darkness, while individual rope fibers snapped with sounds like tiny gunshots in the night air. The 18-year-old soldier, wounded by shrapnel from a mortar round that had burst too close to his foxhole, hung motionless as physics and prayer engaged in a deadly negotiation above his head. Doss felt each breaking strand through his hands like accusations, counting the remaining fibers with the desperate precision of a man calculating whether faith could overcome the simple mathematics of tensile strength. "Doc, what's happening up there?" Kim's voice drifted up from the darkness, carrying the particular terror of a man who could feel his lifeline failing beneath him. "Something's wrong with the rope, ain't it?" The truth that Doss never shared in any official report, never mentioned to chaplains or journalists who later came seeking stories of miraculous courage, was the moment when his faith cracked as completely as the hemp beneath his hands. For perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like 30 years, he genuinely believed that both he and Kim would die in the next heartbeat, plummeting into darkness because a Tennessee boy's childhood knots had finally met their mathematical limit on a cliff face in Okinawa. The breakdown came not as dramatic collapse, but as the quiet dissolution of certainty that had carried him through 6 days of impossible rescues. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, and the whispered prayers that had sustained him through 48 previous evacuations turned to ash in his mouth. The rope continued to fray fiber by fiber, each strand that parted carrying away another fragment of the faith that had made him legendary among men who dealt in the currency of bullets and blood. What saved both their lives was not divine intervention, as the citation would later suggest, but the simple physics of load distribution and the quality of Tennessee hemp that his grandfather had taught him to recognize as a boy. The remaining fibers, stressed beyond their design limits, but woven with the particular strength that came from plants grown in mountain soil, held just long enough for Doss to reset his grip and begin the final phase of Kim's descent with hands that trembled like autumn leaves in a storm. Dr. Patterson, waiting at the bottom of the cliff with the patient efficiency of a man who had learned to catch souls falling from heaven, noticed immediately that something had changed in the rhythm of the 49th evacuation. The rope's movement seemed different, hesitant, uncertain, lacking the steady confidence that had characterized 48 previous rescues. When Kim finally reached the ground, the young soldier's face carried the pale terror of a man who had felt his lifeline failing in real time. "Rope's about done," Kim whispered to the stretcher-bearers who moved him toward the aid station. "Doc nearly dropped me, could feel it giving way up there." The secret that Doss carried down the cliff face that night, coiled around his chest like a weight that would never fully lift, was the knowledge that his legendary faith had faltered at the precise moment when another man's life depended entirely upon its strength. The official reports would record 49 successful evacuations accomplished through remarkable courage and divine protection, but Doss knew the truth was more complicated, that miracles were often indistinguishable from the blind luck of rope fibers that held just long enough for mathematics and prayer to negotiate one final truce. Sergeant Walsh, recovering on his stretcher in the aid station, watched Doss's face as the medic made his final descent of the night and recognized immediately that something fundamental had shifted. The expression was subtle, a tightness around the eyes, a hesitation in movement, but unmistakable to men who had learned to read fear and faith through the grammar of survival that governed life at the edge of human endurance. "Are you all right, Doc?" Walsh asked as Doss coiled the ruined rope with hands that still shook from the night's work. "Look like you've seen something that shook you pretty good." "Just tired," Doss replied, but his voice carried the hollow quality of a man who had learned that even the strongest faith could crack like hemp under pressure, leaving nothing but raw will and the stubborn refusal to let go when letting go meant watching another soul fall into darkness. The 49th evacuation marked the end of the rope service and the beginning of a different kind of wait that would follow Doss through the remaining days on Hacksaw Ridge and into whatever civilian life awaited beyond the war. He had learned the difference between the faith that sustained and the faith that simply held on when sustaining became impossible, and that knowledge would change the texture of every prayer he whispered for the rest of his life. 50 years after the last soul descended that cliff face on Okinawa, Desmond Doss sat in his Tennessee living room, listening to rain drum against windows that faced mountains, where he had learned the knots that later saved 49 lives. The sound of water on glass carried him back to Hacksaw Ridge, with the precision of a time machine, bringing with it the phantom weight of hemp burning through his palms and the echo of voices calling "Medic" through smoke and darkness that existed now only in the geography of memory. The official citation lay framed on his mantelpiece, its language cleaned of the terror and doubt that had made each rescue feel like a negotiation between faith and physics conducted at the edge of human endurance. Words like conspicuous gallantry and divine protection had replaced the memory of rope fibers snapping one by one beneath his burning hands, transforming moments of desperate improvisation into the polished narrative that people needed to believe about heroism and war. His granddaughter, visiting from Atlanta with questions about family history and the medal that rested in a drawer rather than on display, found him studying a length of hemp rope that looked ancient and frayed. She had grown up hearing stories about Hacksaw Ridge, but always in the sanitized version that focused on miraculous rescues rather than the weight that followed her grandfather through 50 years of civilian life, like a shadow that never quite lifted. "Tell me about the rope, Grandpa," she said, settling beside him on the couch that faced windows which framed the same mountains where a Tennessee boy had learned to tie knots without imagining they would someday serve as the technology of salvation. The real story, not the one from the history books. Doss's hands, marked by decades of carpentry work that had never quite erased the scars from 6 days on a cliff face in Okinawa, traced the hemp surface with the unconscious precision of a man reading scripture through his fingertips. Each burn mark and cut carried the weight of a specific descent, a particular soul lowered through darkness, while enemy fire searched for targets that moved like ghosts through a landscape of prayer and desperation. "Rope taught me the difference between faith and hope," he said finally, his voice carrying the particular quietness that came to men who had learned that some truths could only be whispered. "Faith is what gets you up the cliff. Hope is what makes you believe the rope will hold one more time when every fiber's telling you it's done." In the decades that followed the war, Doss had received thousands of letters from families whose sons had made the journey down that cliff face, carried by hemp and stubbornness, through circumstances that defied the normal mathematics of survival. Each letter carried gratitude for reunions that might not have happened without a combat medic's refusal to acknowledge the difference between possible and impossible when lives hung in the balance. But the correspondence that affected him most deeply came from fellow veterans of the 77th Infantry Division. Men who had watched his impossible rescues from foxholes and aid stations, trying to understand how one man's refusal to carry a weapon had somehow become the most effective evacuation operation in their division's history. Their letters spoke of inspiration and wonder, but also of the pressure that came with being expected to live up to a legend that felt heavier than the man who carried it. Lieutenant Morrison, writing from a farm in Ohio 40 years after Hacksaw Ridge, captured the contradiction that haunted many who had witnessed Doss's actions. "You showed us what one man could do when he really believed in something, but you also made the rest of us feel like we weren't believing hard enough. Sometimes I wonder if miracles are harder on the people who watch them than on the people who live them." The rope itself had been retired after Kim's evacuation, its fibers too damaged to risk another life on the uncertain mathematics of hemp stretched beyond its design limits. Doss had carried it down from the ridge that final night, coiling it with hands that shook from exhaustion and the knowledge that even the strongest faith could fray under pressure, leaving nothing but will and the stubborn refusal to let go when letting go meant watching souls fall into darkness. Dr. Patterson, in a medical journal article written 30 years after the war, attempted to quantify the statistical impossibility of 49 successful evacuations conducted by improvised rope system under enemy fire. His calculations suggested that the probability of such success approached zero when measured against standard military medical protocols, leading him to conclude that some human achievements existed outside the normal boundaries of science and luck. But for Doss, the mathematics that mattered were simpler and more personal. 49 men who had returned to families that might have lost them, 49 voices that had called medic and received an answer that defied every principle of tactical medicine he had learned in training. The rope had held not through divine intervention, but through the simple physics of Tennessee hemp and the stubborn refusal of inanimate objects to acknowledge the impossibility of their circumstances. As rain continued to fall against his windows, carrying the sound of water that had once mixed with blood on coral limestone half a world away, Doss understood that the weight he had carried for 50 years was not guilt or doubt, but the simple knowledge that heroism was often indistinguishable from the blind luck of rope fibers that held just long enough for prayer and physics to negotiate one final truce. The frayed hemp coiled in his lap like a sleeping serpent, its scarred surface bearing witness to 6 days when faith and physics had collaborated in the mathematics of miracles on a cliff face where 49 souls learned that sometimes the distance between heaven and earth could be measured in the precise, tensile strength of Tennessee rope, held in the burning palms of one man who refused to let go. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.